obviously, pretty much immediately post that was when American wines were pulled from the shelves and no longer allowed to be imported into the province. The one positive, as Michaela said, is that this has opened up a massive gap in the market and on shelves. And one thing to keep in mind for Italy in general was they, for the last almost 2 years, have been actually right on the tail of the United States. And so even with American wines on the shelf, there was some very, very healthy competition. We're talking maybe 1% or 2% as far as share of market and people purchasing these wines. So there already is a massively established Italian market for Italian wines in Ontario. And with the LCBO, this is now a new opportunity to basically fill the gaps.
Welcome to the Wine to Wine Vinitaly Business Forum 2025 Chicago edition, where global wine professionals share insights, strategies, and inspiration from this year's conference. Let's dive into today's session and explore the ideas shaping the future of wine.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to introduce the next seminar, which is part of the cycle of the North American market focus, called Cracking Canada, Understanding its Government Liquor Boards and Unlocking the Opportunities Within and Beyond. This is certainly a difficult task because of the intricacies, the difficulties of every province being different between themselves rather than all the opportunities that can arise in a moment where the market is living certainly a particular moment. To address this topic, which is not a small topic, for 30 minutes, we have Michaela Morris. Thank you, Michaela. DipWSET, but especially a writer, a contributor to Decanter, if I'm correct, first and foremost, rather than a pedigree in the industry between the importing and the buying processes in Canada. Jenna Briscoe, as well, coming from the western world of Canada, which we will discover is so different from the East itself, and as well bringing experience as educator, buyer, and importer in the Canadian wine industry.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for the introduction and for being here, because you've done a lot of work in Canada, so you understand the market very well. I'd also like to thank Jenna, who I'm presenting with today, because Jenna is the one who did all of the research to get the most recent data for this presentation. And it's not the easiest thing to do in Canada sometimes, to glean these sorts of statistics. So thank you so much, Jenna. Cracking Canada, Understanding its Government Liquor Control Boards and Unlocking the Opportunities Within and Beyond. You might notice that we did not include the word monopoly in the title. And this is because sometimes referring to Canada as a monopoly is a bit of a misnomer. In our country, we have 10 provinces. These are the equivalent, more or less, of the states here in the United States. So we've got these 10 provinces. We also have 3 territories. And liquor distribution falls under the legislation of the provincial governments. What this means is that we have, in fact, 13 markets in Canada, each with its own unique system. And each of these provinces and territories have their own identity and their own culture, so different wine markets. Before we get into the different wine markets, I just want to take a quick look at the national wine market. If you look at the value of wine that we brought in last year, 2.67 billion Canadian dollars. This is before markup and taxes. If my math and my information serves me correct, this is about 1/3 to 1/4 of what the US brought in the same time period. But you have to remember that Canada has about 1/8 of the population of the US. So even if we are smaller in size, in population, we are a valid wine market, in case you didn't realize that already. You will also notice here that the top 3 countries of export for Canada, across Canada, are France, Italy, and the United States. In March 2025, we pressed pause on bringing in wine from the United States and pulled U.S. alcohol products from our shelves in response to the tariffs on Canadian products coming into the U.S. You can see that this leaves a huge gap and opportunities, in my opinion, and I think many others, for other markets beyond the U.S. for wine in Canada. Looking further into the national market, it's also important to note that for many years, wine was increasing in terms of both volume and value, but in the last couple of years, we've seen a decline. So in volume, in the last year, in 2023, we saw a 3% decrease in volume. There was a slight increase in value. However, that is only attributable to inflation. So the market overall is, we could say, flat and in very slight decline. One other thing that I want to point out on this is that 28% of the wine sold in Canada is domestic wine, is deemed as domestic wine. So for those of you who don't know, we actually make wine in Canada from our own grapes, and there are 4 provinces that produce wine. So today we're going to look at 4 of the most important provinces in Canada for wine sales. So on the West Coast, British Columbia and Alberta, together they represent about 22% of the wine sold in all of Canada. Going to the central part of the country, Ontario was always regarded as the biggest market in Canada for wine. However, it is now second to Quebec, that takes about 33% of wine sales, just over 33% of all wine sales in Canada is coming from Quebec. Again, just to put this into perspective, the population of Quebec is about 9 million versus Ontario, which is 16 million. We'll talk further about that. So if we can keep going onward here, we're going to start in Ontario. Ontario is our most populous province. It does have a diverse ethnicity. The Italian community is very strong there, so the Italian culture, Italian wines has always been very strong in Ontario. On the other hand, Ontario is also our largest wine producer, so making a lot of wine, and people have become more and more loyal to our local wines than they were even in the past. It's also, in terms of per capita consumption, while they're making a lot of wine, they're actually below the average, which you may have gleaned from the last statement I made with respect to Quebec. And they're also below the average per capita in terms of what they're spending on wine as well. In terms of the Liquor Control Board, because each province has its own Liquor Control Board, the Liquor Control Board in Ontario is referred to as the LCBO. I want to again underline the fact that the LCBO does not equal Canada. So if you are a wine producer and you work in Canada and you work with the LCBO, that does not mean that you work in the rest of provinces of Canada. The LCBO is exclusive just to Ontario. Now, each of these liquor control boards that we have across Canada work differently. They all act as regulators and revenue collectors. In the case of Ontario, they also import, distribute, and retail wine. And this is where we talk about monopoly, simply because the retail stores in Ontario are the strongest force. So almost 82% of all wines that are sold in Ontario are sold at the government stores. Since 2016, grocery stores have been allowed to sell wine. However, the wine that are sold through grocery stores in Ontario, they have to be wines that are listed by the LCBO as well. The last one, the privately owned wine retail stores, they can only sell what they produce. Okay, so you're not seeing competition there with those. Speed dating in Canada here, just to give you the point. So there are different categories for wine listings at the LCBO, but if you get a general listing with LCBO stores and you can keep that listing, you can sell a lot of wine. Typically, these are more the volume-based wines. They also have another avenue, which is their vintages program, which tends to be more of these boutique wines. They did start an e-commerce project, and it looked like it was something that it would take off during the pandemic, but it has to this point fizzled, which means that people are still buying their wines at bricks and mortar places. That is where they're buying them. Now, I want to point out this consignment program. The consignment program are for wines that are not listed by the LCBO. The people who are buying through the consignment program are mainly the restaurants. And this accounts for about $100 million worth of wine a year. It's not a small sum. However, it's definitely, again, not in competition with the LCBO stores. But this means that there is another channel if you don't have a listing with the LCBO. However, the wine will still be imported through the government because they are the sole importer of wines. The way that you can attain a listing through the LCBO stores is essentially through a tender process. They still rely on this tender process, and it is a committee-based tasting. Obviously, you have different buyers who are in charge of different categories, but they still taste as a committee, and there are very well-detailed parameters in terms of what they are looking for, whether it be region, price point, as well as certifications. They do give sort of extra points to things like lightweight bottles and sustainability. So it's always something to keep in your back pocket. Beyond that, you ultimately need, when you do get a listing with the LCBO, you ultimately still need your agent, so an appointed agent who can continue to promote and sell your wine so that you can keep up with the target sales that you need in order to keep a listing at LCBO stores. I'm going to pass it over to Jenna, who's going to talk a little bit more in detail about the trends right now in Ontario.
Wine sales for the fiscal year of 2024 through the LCBO were almost $2.4 billion, and that's just wine. One thing to keep in mind with regards to Italy, this is from the LCBO's annual report for the ending of their fiscal year in 2024. Obviously, pretty much immediately post that was when American wines were pulled from the shelves and no longer allowed to be imported into the province. The one positive, as Michaela said, is that this has opened up a massive gap in the market and on shelves. And one thing to keep in mind for Italy in general was they, for the last almost 2 years, have been actually right on the tail of the United States. And so even with American wines on the shelf, there was some very, very healthy competition. We're talking maybe 1% or 2% as far as share of market and people purchasing these wines. So there already is a massively established Italian market for Italian wines in Ontario. And with the LCBO, this is now a new opportunity to basically fill the gaps. Consumers seem to be familiar with these wines. They are purchasing them. They have been purchasing them for a long time. And so this is a new spot where Italy has finally overtaken the US, only to second to Canada as far as the categories that are being purchased. In general, as far as trends, and when we see this overall, this is probably going to be a little bit repetitive as far as the country goes, with the exception of maybe when we get to Alberta, but a shift sort of to fresher styles. So we see a decline in red wines and the purchasing of those, but a slight uptick in things like white and rosé. Definitely some value-driven purchasing. As Michaela noted, this is a market where people actually don't spend that much in general, but if you are able to sort of show that value-driven commodity, consumers will follow. And then, of course, high-low pricing. So taking into strong consideration at what price something comes into the market, and if there is any kind of flexibility as far as discounting and that sort of thing. And then, of course, overall lighter alcohol. Tough to say if this is a trend that will continue, although we have seen it stay pretty strong over the last couple of years. But these are all things to take into consideration when trying to think about what would be a right fit for this market.
So looking at the Quebec market, Quebec, many of you might know that there is a strong connection to the French heritage, and just the whole European sensibility around wine with food. This was maybe a little bit more of a traditional market from the sense of thinking about wine that way. Yet at the same time, also probably the most progressive market in Canada. They're always ahead of the trend within Canada, so maybe following worldwide trends. They've really embraced the whole natural wine movement as well. They're the highest per capita consumers of wine. They're also the highest per capita spenders on wine. And traditionally, they were also the highest per capita drinkers of red wine. We'll see if that still holds true. I know that Jenna has more information on that as we go ahead. So in Quebec, the Liquor Control Board is called the Société des Alcools du Québec. That is the SAQ, or the SAC, as some people refer to it. And very much the same as you saw in Ontario. This is a liquor control board that not only regulates and collects their revenue, they're also warehousing it, importing it, distributing it, and retailing it. And in fact, the SAQ does not recognize intermediaries. So they deal directly with the supplier or the producer. The agent is there to work on the promotion and the sales of the wine, and that is made very clear by the SAQ. Similar to Ontario, in terms of the government stores, the SAQ stores, these stores represent about 80% of all wine sales in Quebec. Also, similar to Ontario, you have a committee process when they're looking at listing the wines. Obviously, there's a hierarchy there, but there is a committee process. That sort of devolved since the pandemic and maybe rests more on the shoulders of the category managers and the Director of Accounts of Europe. Again, different listings at the SAQ stores as well. You have those regular listings. These are wines that are sold. You can sell them for years and years. Again, if you get a listing with the SAQ, you can be extremely successful, but you have to be willing to work on promotions. So price discounts and paying into programs, things of this sort. That's very important for success. You also have these specialty listings that may not continue over the years. However, if you do reach a good sales target, those specialty listings can continue and be reordered. And so that's why it's really important to work with an agent on the promotions and sales in Quebec. One of the things that's a little bit different, they don't necessarily work on tenders in Quebec. Instead, what they do is they have this assortment plan that is like a 2-year plan where they look at what they want to have in their stores for those next couple of years. And they're very explicit, very detailed, region, grape variety, price point, whether it's organic or natural or orange, whatever the case may be. And this assortment plan is available for public consumption. And it's really important to look at something like this because instead of throwing something at the wall and hoping it sticks, here you have all of the parameters given to you because it can be a lengthy process. So it takes time and it also takes money. So rather than wasting your money, it's really important to take a look at what the SAQ actually wants to put on their shelves. That being said, there are ad hoc listings that occur as well. And those ad hoc listings, kind of bypassing this assortment plan, generally tends to be the most successful with wines that are kind of iconic of nature or have garnered very high point scores, to be quite blunt. Finally, you have the private order that you see at the bottom. This is a little bit like that consignment program that they have in Ontario. So this is where most of the restaurants are buying for. So once again, wines that aren't listed through the SAQ. So about 85 to 90% of private order is sold to restaurants. But what we saw during and then after the pandemic is more collectors looking at that private order category to select their wine. So a very interesting alternative if you don't have a listing at the SAQ stores. Over to you, Jenna.
So a very quick breakdown of still wines by country of origin and what their share of the market is. As Michaela noted, for any of you who don't know, Quebec has a very strong ties to France with the Francophone culture. And so France will likely always be number one in terms of international imports. But Italy obviously takes up a huge share. White's definitely growing. And one thing to note is that, as Michaela said, red wine consumption in Quebec used to be the highest in the country by far. But in the last 5 years, that has dropped about 10%. And that share of red wine consumption is actually being taken over by whites and rosés. So this is an opportunity for anyone who is thinking of introducing white wines to the market. There is not even a renewed, but a new appreciation for these wines and some areas for discovery, especially if you're trying to put forward something a little bit different. And then in regards to trends, natural wines definitely, and Quebec really probably is at the forefront in terms of Canada with this trend. As Michaela mentioned, in the assortment plan that the SAQ puts out, the bulk of tenders explicitly state that only offers of wine holding a sustainability/fair trade certification recognized in the province of Quebec will be considered. So this is something that is very important, not only to the SAQ, but to their consumers as well, which is very key to keep in mind. Like I said before, a big increase in the consumption of whites, which is taking that share of reds, and overall a trend towards lighter and easier to drink wines. This idea of glou-glou or chilled reds is a big one in Quebec. Rosé becoming a more sort of everyday beverage, which I think we have seen obviously internationally, but definitely rings true in this province. And then there is a big drinking local push, but the amount of wine that Quebec makes every year is very, very small. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it direct competition, but something to keep in mind. And then small formats. Again, a big shift in the last 5 years where during the pandemic, large formats were heavily sought out, but small formats is now something that a lot of their customers are looking for. And then as inflation rises and the world lights on fire, value picks, again, is a big one in the SAQ and in the province of Quebec.
For Quebec, do they require bilingual labels?
In fact, if your wine is on shelves in any province in Canada, technically you need bilingual back labels. So, for example, in British Columbia, generally your importer can help you with that. But definitely there is an ask for bilingual labels for sure. So on to British Columbia, which is a province that Jenna and I live in, so we'll try not to spend too much time on it. We have a population of just under 6 million, so we're kind of about a third of the population of Ontario, yet we're almost half of their wine sales, which means that we have a higher per capita consumption of wine. In fact, we are the second highest after Quebec for consuming wine. We're also the highest per capita consumers of white wine in Canada. And that might be due to a number of different things. You can see the mountains here, but in fact, most of the population of British Columbia lives by the coast. So we have a very mild climate, not as chilly as other places in Canada for sure. I have access to a lot of seafood. There's very much this living healthy and sportive lifestyle. And we have a diversity of cuisine as well. We are the gateway to a variety of Asian. We have great ingredients. So the cuisine there is very, very diverse. And perhaps in some ways, we're a younger market than Quebec in terms of wine, but also less traditional in terms of how we think about wine as well. We're also the second larger producer of wine after Ontario as well. And I would say that even before the current situation with the US, we have always been very fiercely loyal to the wines that we produce. Looking at this picture, I would say that British Columbia is somewhat of a paradise. I really like living there, but there are drawbacks. One of them is the very high cost of living and the fact that we have some of the highest markup structure, not just in Canada, but in the world. So wine is expensive. That being said, people are not spending an exorbitant amount of wine. 70% of the wines that are on our shelves at BC liquor stores are $20 or below. That equals about 3.5 euro ex cellar or $5 US ex cellar. The Liquor Control Board in British Columbia is called the BC LDB. They work a little bit differently than they do in Quebec and Ontario because they do not import the wine. The importation of wine is the responsibility of the importer or the agent. So it works a little bit differently. They do have retail stores. So there are government-owned and operated stores in British Columbia. However, it is not a retail monopoly. 45% of wine sales go through BC liquor stores, but we also have about 700 private wine stores that do not need to put BC liquor store products on their shelves. So there is a very big opportunity for wines that do not have a listing with the BC LDB. The BCLDB does do somewhat of a tender in terms of asking for specific wines, but it is nowhere near the controls and the formalities that you see in Ontario, and there is much more opportunity for ad hoc listings as well.
I will be extra quick. So this is just a very quick breakdown between the fiscal year of 2024 and 2025 for the wholesale market in British Columbia. You can see Canada and the US making up a huge portion of that, and Italy and France, for the most part, staying neck and neck. So currently, Italy is the only country that is actually growing, if not staying stable. And just on the right-hand side, you can see the breakdown of the regions as to what consumers are gravitating towards. And one major thing of note is that between Italian sparkling wine and then Prosecco, sort of treated as its own category, they make up about 50% of all sparkling wine sales in the province. And so there is a huge opportunity, but also massive competition when it comes to sparkling in this market. A couple things to take into consideration if you are looking to put something forward to the BCL, which has about 200 retail stores in the province, that they really are looking for Italian products, but there has been a big targeted reduction on premium wines. So really putting forward value or something that has a real point of difference, whether that be a new appellation or point scores, anything like that, can definitely increase your chances.
Last but not least, we're going to do Alberta in 1 minute here. So Alberta, big news here because it works very differently from the rest of the provinces. While there is still AGLC, which is the Liquor Control Board there, they do not have government stores. So it is completely privatized on the retail side of things, which has its advantages and disadvantages we can discuss afterwards if anyone is interested. It's a bit of the Wild West over there. I'll let Jenna just finish up talking about what are some of the current trends, because that's the most important thing, and then we'll let you go.
So very quickly, this is a market that has always purchased a lot of American wine, and generally speaking, their palates tend to shift towards bigger, bolder wines, specifically reds, taking up the main share. But since the pulling of US and then the return of American wines in this province, Italy has actually risen to the top 3. So Italy is currently the third largest category in Alberta, roughly a 12% market share, and it continues to grow. One interesting place where we do see a little bit of growth is in retail price brands of about $25 to $49.99, which is not the case for a lot of other provinces. And so that is something, again, where you can find some sort of market share for those wines.
Let's give it up for Michaela Morris, Jenna Briscoe, and thank you, Alessandro Pasqua, for filling in. Thank you very much.
Listen to the Italian Wine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Himalaya FM, and more. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the show. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps cover equipment, production, and publication costs. Until next time, cin cin.